Well, thank you so much for joining me. Today I'd like to talk a little bit more about the role of CPOs in delivering good planning outcomes. We'd like to speak a little bit more about the experiences at Westminster and Victoria, but before we go into that, I'd like to ask you, Michele, to tell us a bit more about CPOs and the legal context.
Well, the starting point for any CPO in terms of getting it made and confirmed is that there must be a compelling case in the public interest. So the local authority and the confirming minister are always going to have that, or should have that, at the forefront of their mind before they embark on a CPO journey and confirm it. In the context of planning CPOs, the enabling legislation for a local authority is going to be the Town and Country Planning Act, which is section 226. And what that allows is a local authority to make a CPO either to facilitate the redevelopment or improvement of its area, or to promote the proper planning of its area. And it's normally the former, which we see being used up and down the country to make CPOs for regeneration purposes. As part of that enabling legislation, there's a limb that needs to be satisfied, and that's that a local authority, when it wants to make a CPO, must be satisfied that it's going to promote or improve the economic or environmental or social well-being of the area, which is kind of known as the well-being power. And that's the sort of statutory framework for actually making a planning CPO. There's then the CPO guidance, which has been published by the government. The last one, I think, was 2015. And what that does is it sets out the justification that needs to sit behind a CPO. And so local authorities should always have regard to that when they're making a CPO, and absolutely, if they're before the Secretary of State, he's going to have regard to that in deciding whether to confirm a CPO. And the sorts of things that will require is having regard to the public sector equality duty. So there are groups with protected characteristics which must be properly assessed when making a CPO, and the impact that could have on them. And then there's other things like, is the scheme underlying the CPO deliverable? Is there funding in place for it? Are there any other legal or planning impediments to that? Is the local planning framework supportive of the scheme? And so it's a range of things that then need to be explored as part of that CPO process. And I suppose what I should have said right from the outset is, of course, CPO is meant to be a last resort. So what local authorities and developers who are looking for local authorities to use CPO powers is engage with people in the first instance, because, you know, ultimately you're taking land off people, you're affecting private land interests. So there's a need to be sensitive about that and to have regard to the wider impact that could have, hence the need for the public interest test. And that's widely, broadly, how a CPO will work. And then it's largely procedural, and there's a series of statutes and regulations which then set out how you actually start the process and the documents that need to be put in place to facilitate the CPO.
Okay, so quite a long process potentially, with lots of considerations and tests almost to be met before bringing forward a CPO. I'd like to bring you in. You've had direct experience of delivering or implementing a CPO in a local authority context. Perhaps you could just share a bit about that.
Yeah, touching on some of what Michele has been saying, the majority of compulsory purchase orders that we use in a local authority context is done under a planning power. So you have to really prove a well-being for the whole community. And I think following the Aylesbury decision case, local authorities are now more conscious to make sure that we undertake effective consultation and engagement. So from the outset, bringing on board residents, stakeholders, and making sure that they can see a wider vision for the communities and redevelopment of the areas. And that impacts on leaseholders. Often lots of packages are put together by local authorities, allowing them to return to the area, and for tenants as well, giving them options to return, and just making sure that they can see a bigger picture of the vision of the area, which is better housing, better social housing. And commercial premises as well, providing employment space.
Okay, so engagement absolutely central to the CPO process, and a real focus on the vision of what can be achieved. Were there any particular challenges that you've encountered from a local authority context? Or?
Yeah, I think the challenges are actually with consultation and engagement. I think sometimes you always get a group of individual or one person who doesn't buy into the idea from the outset, and obviously that can then delay the process if that becomes an objector at the inquiry stage. So it's really important that we make people see that it's for a bigger it's a bigger picture.
Yeah,
it's
so,
not just about one aspect.
So engagement, and then but also communicating that bigger picture, that vision about what can happen in an area. I suppose that's a good time to turn to talk about what's been going on in a specific CPO context in Victoria and the transformation we've seen there. Justin, you've been involved in schemes there. Perhaps you could tell us about what's been going on there.
Just to pick up on what Michelle and Theo have been saying, I think CPO very much we view it as a method of last resort. It's expensive, it's time consuming, and we use it as a facilitator to help us. So largely in sort of site assemblies and everything else that's there, we try and do as much as we can before we go and instigate the CPO process. We've been involved in a project called NOVA, and Land Securities have a long-term interest in Victoria and the regeneration of this area of SW1. Westminster, we engaged very early on to get them buy-in and to get this, and so we had a shared vision for what we could do in that part of Victoria. And where we got to was that actually the only way we could have any type of certainty over implementing and over timescale was to go through the CPO process. We didn't actually use it. We actually ended up negotiating with everyone towards the end. But it was having the process in place and having the ability to do that got certain people to the table at the end that enabled us to get vacant possession. The scheme that we're talking about is NOVA. It's 5 buildings essentially, of which we've built 3. And it's one of those rare projects that clearly has the public, there's a compelling interest for the public. We're delivering nearly 5,000 new jobs into the area. Retail, we were redesigning streets. We were taking brand new architecture right as you come out of Victoria Station. So the case was there. And actually when we got through the process, we found it relatively straightforward, but expensive.
So absolutely a method of last resort, expensive, but really needing to put that engagement process at the heart of it. How do you sell this bigger vision to your stakeholders?
Again, I think it comes back down to consultation and engagement and starting early, making sure you outline the options and the alternatives.
Okay. Any other thoughts on sort of the delivery side of things, Michelle?
That you've got the housing white paper at the moment, which is saying there should be more use of CPO for stalled sites. So I think probably we're going to see more use of CPO. And it's just about, as Justin said, it's the time factor and the cost factor. There are certain measures which have come out in the Housing Planning Act and the new Neighbourhood and Planning Act, which is trying to look at how it's trying to make that process quicker. I guess we'll have to wait and see how that works out. I think it is a good tool for regeneration, particularly where you've got large schemes where site assemblies and fragmented ownership, and often it's the better way of dealing with site assembly.
Sure. So it sounds like it's really enabled the scheme that the process at least has enabled.
It definitely works on the bigger, more complex projects, things where you need to sort of have various different interests all coming together. I don't think it's really a tool, one size fits all. I think only on those bigger projects, on the more complex ones, does it actually come into its own. I don't think it is an easy answer for developers to try and assemble a site, because generally what you find is that no one really wants to go through this process, particularly on a local authority level, unless they can see the true benefit of going through it. Because as Michelle said, you are taking away land interests and everything else, so it has to be, the prize at the end has to be worth it for the public benefit to enable the process to start. So it isn't quite simply two landowners falling out, therefore we'll get the local authority on board, because it's quite hard, and making sure that everyone is aiming towards the same page and everyone can see the benefits it's not something that people willingly want to go in, I think.
Okay. So communicating those benefits with it has to have the real focus on a good planning outcome, both from the legal context, but also in very practical terms, in terms of working through the bigger picture as you described it with communities. Okay, thank you so much.